And welcome to the Jane Austen University of Southampton Future Learn MOOC Roundup for week 2. We really hope that you've been enjoying the course, and what I'm going to do today is just do a roundup of some of the comments, queries and questions that we've been exploring on the message boards, give you perhaps a little bit more information to contextualise some of the sources that we've been looking at, and also at the end I'm going to introduce you to a couple of books that I think you might like and that might enhance your enjoyment of Jane Austen's novels just that little bit more. So what I would like to do today is begin by talking about the close reading that we've asked you to do of Mansfield Park. I will then move on to discuss money in a little bit more depth in Jane Austen, because we would, I think, benefit from knowing what those sums that are mentioned in the novels actually mean in terms of spending power, just to, contextualise it a little bit more. And then I'm going to talk about inheritance. There's been some discussion about inheritance practices and law on the message boards, and I wanted to make sure that everybody was up to speed and knew exactly how inheritance law in the 18th century operated. So what I'm going to do to begin with is talk about the close reading exercise on Mansfield Park that we set you. Now, the key to thinking about this, now there was a question actually on the message boards, and it's one of you said, am I reading too much into this? And the answer is no. Jane Austen wrote this. This is a highly symbolic passage. She wrote this deliberately. There are metaphors, there are images embedded in it. And as literary scholars, part of our job is to unpack those images, and they are going to help us understand the text. So you can say anything you like. You can interpret that text in any way you want, so long as you have evidence to support what you're saying. So I would say go in there, be bold and be brave, and see what you think that passage is trying to tell you. But I will just give you a few pointers. So the first thing is think about gardens, think about the symbolism of gardens, think about perhaps the first garden and what happened there, and how that might be being used by Austen as a sort of evocative background for the action that unfolds at Southerton. Secondly, just think about the areas of garden that we're talking about. So there are 3 areas of garden. There are the very formal gardens that everybody retreats from. There's the wilderness, which is of course planned but also intended to look as though it's an informal garden. And then there is the parkland beyond the gate. What do these symbolise? And how are the characters using these highly symbolic areas of garden? How are they behaving? I always like to think about this as almost a theatrical performance. Obviously, theatre and performance is a theme that dominates Mansfield Park. And if you can almost think about this bit of the novel as Fanny gets tired and she sits down, it's almost as though she's an audience member and the other groups kind of come in and perform and they do their bit. But although they're trying to perform in a social sense, they are trying to behave in a particular way because that's what society says they should do. They also unwittingly, they all display their true selves, either through their actions or how they're interacting with the other people. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about. And finally, the symbolism of the gate and the parkland beyond. Now, you've got to remember that Mr. Rushworth owns all of this. He is the owner, the legal owner of the gardens and the parkland and the gate. They cannot get through the gate, so he goes back to get the key, which is, if you like, the legal method or the proper method for accessing the parkland beyond. But whilst he's gone, the others, Henry Crawford and Maria Bertram in particular, get bored and they decide to take an illegal route out into the parkland. They kind of squeeze through the gate. They don't wait for Mr. Rushworth to come back with the key. And just think about the symbolism of that, because what is played out in the gardens is essentially a synopsis of what's going to happen through the rest of the novel, and the characters' fates are revealed in that beautiful and highly symbolic scene. The next thing I want to talk about is the money. And there is an excellent book by a scholar called Edward Copeland called Women Writing About Money, Women's Fiction in England, 1790 to 1820. And I've just checked, and chunks of it are available on Google Scholar. If you don't know about Google Scholar, go to Google, type in Google Scholar and click on the link that will come up. When you go to Google Scholar, it will give you access to not whole books and articles, but it will give you important chunks and sections from them. And most of this is up on Google Scholar, so I'll put a link up so you can follow it. But I think he gives a really, really good contextualisation of what the various amounts of money in Austen mean. So, for example, we started around £50 per annum, and this is the annual income that is left to each of the Dashwood women by their great uncle, and it really isn't very much at all. Their total income obviously is a little bit more because they have their mother's wealth as well. But £50 per annum is kind of like, it really is poverty level. It's the level of income that Mrs. Smith also has in Persuasion. So you can see how little it is. I mean, she really is in desperate circumstances. And interestingly, it is more than the Bennet girls will have once their mother dies, because they will only have £40 per annum. So we can see by this calculation, if we think the Dashwood situation is pretty desperate, the Bennets will be in an even worse mess when Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet die. And it's important to remember this. A lot of people think Mrs. Bennet is, she is written as a comic figure. She is very overblown, she gets over emotional, she does get hysterical. However, in some ways, she is the person who has their head screwed on correctly. She knows and she understands the deprivations and the difficulties that her girls will face on £40 per annum if they do not make a good marriage. Copeland moves on to £500 per annum. Now this gives you 3 servants, so you would have 3 indoor servants, and you might even be able to afford an occasional gardener. And 500 is of course what the Dashwoods are living on in their cottage in Devon. So it's not a lot, but it gives you a kind of basic level of genteel living. Moving up to £800 to £1,000 a year, you stop being able to measure in servants by this point, and you can measure in carriages. £800 a year is probably the minimum amount that you need to be able to run a carriage. And this is a very interesting figure, because if you think about the people in Austen who have carriages and who don't have carriages, think about Mr. Perry, the apothecary. He's obviously doing very, very well indeed, because as Copeland points out, he can afford a carriage. So he really is doing very well indeed. If you move up again, so you've got an income of 4,000 to 5,000, you can stop measuring in carriages and you can think about the characters having money in terms of being able to afford a country house and also access the London season. And Copeland points out that Fanny Price is quite right to be concerned that Mary Crawford expects Edmund Bertram to give her access to the season on an income of £1,700 per annum. He really would need somewhere between £4,000 and £5,000 per annum. There is no way that they are going to be able to afford that. And Fanny Price is quite right to think that Mary Crawford might ruin him. So hopefully that's given you a little bit more context. Do go and check the article out. It's absolutely fascinating. It ranges much more widely than Austen, but it helps you to understand what those figures actually mean. The third thing that I would like to talk about is inheritance practice. Inheritance law in England is, like most law in England, basically came to us from the Normans. And the word primogenitor, I noticed that on the message boards. Now, what primogenitor means is that the oldest child, so long as they are male, if there are male and female children, the oldest male child will inherit. However, strict primogeniture in England means if you have only female children, or there is one female child, that female child will inherit in preference to collateral male relatives. So English primogeniture prefers a direct female beneficiary of a will rather than collateral males. So if you were a single female child of a rich man and there was nothing else, there were no wills, there were no entails, you would inherit. It is because people, as a social function, decided not to allow women to inherit, that they used devices such as wills and later the entail, which of course we come across in Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, that they used these legal devices to circumvent female inheritance. But in the absence of an entail, the Bennet girls would inherit Longbourn. There's no question about that. And actually, the issue of inheritance is discussed in Pride and Prejudice because Lady Catherine talks to Elizabeth about it, talks to her about the entail, and says that in her husband's family, an entail was not thought necessary. So Lady Catherine's daughter is due to inherit Rosings, as far as we know, and Lady Catherine thinks this is entirely appropriate. And just as an aside, there is no indication, although I think perhaps we might not wish to sit next to Lady Catherine if we were at a dinner party. She might be a bit much. But there is no indication that she is mismanaging Rosings or that there is a problem with the estate because it is effectively being run by a woman. And we assume Lady Catherine is running it. There is no indication to the contrary. But there is nothing in Jane Austen's books that I have been able to find that indicates that women were considered by her to not be suitable inheritors or managers of property. Mrs. Ferrers presumably manages all the property. There is no indication that she can't cope. Mrs. Jennings has property. Again, there is no indication that she can't cope. We might not like these people, but there is no indication that they are bad property managers. Interestingly, the house that Jane Austen's brother inherited in Chawton House, as opposed to the cottage, Chawton House, had been owned by a quite formidable lady who ran Chawton and ran all her other estates as well. I mean, Chawton was the smaller of the estates that she inherited. She inherited by default. She ended up being the last survivor in a generation. So her brothers died and the property that they'd inherited all came down to her. So it wasn't a conscious decision that she should inherit. However, when she married for the second time, her marriage agreement did say that in the absence of any sons, that they would allow a daughter to inherit. This was changed later, and she put a male entail into her will, which is how Edward Austen Knight ended up inheriting. But presumably she herself had no qualms about a woman running the estates because she was running the estates and she was doing it pretty well, actually. She was quite a character. Apparently she used to have the church bells at Chawton rung before she went out in her carriage to sort of announce that she was coming out into the village and that people should, behave appropriately towards her. You can imagine everybody sort of bowing and scraping and doffing their caps. But there is I think in Austen, I can find no evidence that she disproves of female inheritance or thinks that women were not capable of running estates. And I think the opposite. We might not like Lady Catherine, but that doesn't make her incompetent. Interestingly, on the subject of inheritance, under the law of coverture, so when a woman got married, certain common law doctrines came into play that limited her right to own and control property. So any chattels and any money that she brought to the marriage automatically went to her husband forever. They never came back to her, even if her husband predeceased her. She never saw them again unless there was a trust set up that specifically reserved them for her benefit. However, land operated differently under coverture. Under the common law, Any land that a wife owned did not pass to her husband. He was entitled to any rents and profits that came from it. And she couldn't dispose of it, or they couldn't dispose of it without each other's agreement. But after he died, she would have sole control of her land. It would all pass back to her. And I think that's really important. I mean, we shouldn't be thinking about this in terms of perhaps that people, really thought women were excellent land managers and landholders. I don't think that's true. And I think Austen is probably slightly at odds with social convention and social thinking on this point. But if you think about it, land is an absolute basic from the medieval period right through till the 19th century. If you had to feed yourself or support yourself, land was the basis of the economy. So in that sense, you can see this kind of thread of land holding that was allowed to of female land holding that was allowed to continue. You can see it as a sort of insurance policy whereby women would not be destitute and women would not starve. And then you see a shift coming in the 18th century when investments and stocks and shares start to take over land ownership in terms of what women were given on their marriages. So when women married, built into the marriage settlement, there would be trusts if they wanted to reserve any of the chattels to themselves. However, there was usually effectively a pension built in as well, which was called jointure. And this meant that if the woman was widowed, she would have something that she could survive on. And this used to be land. Up until the Tudor period, this would be land, but this gradually gets eroded with the arrival of stocks and shares and the kind of new financial economy in the city, and women more and more are given money or stocks and shares as their jointure rather than land. So I'm not going to say you get a fall off in land holding, because research has shown that somewhere between 11 and 20% of all land in England from the medieval period to the 19th century is owned by women, and this operates as a continuum. But land as a support for widows definitely becomes less common as the 18th century goes on and as the use of stocks and shares and investments normalises. So you did have land holding and landowning women, and the numbers of them seem to operate on this continuum somewhere between 11 and 20%. There's been research by Brian E. McDonough at Hull University to show this. However, insofar as supporting widows is concerned, it was tended to be things like stocks and shares, and also there tended, as the 18th century went on, there seems to have been a tendency for the support that's given to widows to come to an end if they were to remarry, which I think is also important. So widows are not necessarily taking a lot of money into their second marriages, although, of course, the list that you saw would speak otherwise, but this is probably their fortunes which have been reserved and are part of a trust. So anything to do with money or chattels that a woman owned when she got married, that would have gone to her husband unless it was set aside in a trust. However, land did not pass to the husband. It would have been very difficult for the wife or the husband to get rid of it. They couldn't have done it without mutual consent, but on the husband's death, it returned absolutely to the wife. Okay, so it's all a little bit confusing, but if you think about it in terms of inheritance anyway, that direct descendants, whether they're male or female, are preferred by the English legal system to collateral descendants. But for social reasons, people started using legal devices such as wills and entails in order to circumvent those principles of English law. Right, now finally, a couple of books I thought you might be interested in. This book is excellent. John Mullen, What Matters in Jane Austen. It's got lots of interesting little nuggets about the questions you might ask, such as, do we ever see the lower classes in Jane Austen? And the answer is not often. And he provides explanations. What do the characters call each other? We've got what are the right and wrong ways to propose. It's a brilliant book and I absolutely recommend it. And secondly, we've had some people asking about biographies for a sort of wider insight into Austen and her family and their family circumstances. I would recommend this by Deirdre Le Fay, which is Jane Austen, A Family Record. You can buy, there will be new copies available, but you can also get very good secondhand copies, and this is a good secondhand copy. So not too expensive. So I would absolutely recommend those two books to you. I hope that you've enjoyed this roundup. It got a little bit convoluted as I started talking about coverture versus inheritance, but I hope that it was reasonably followable for you. I'll be on the boards if you want to ask me any questions over the coming week, and I hope you continue to enjoy the course. Thank you for coming, thank you for listening, and thank you for continuing the discussions on the message boards.